Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker. I'm joined by Helena, aka NoJusticeMTG. Good to see you again.
Absolutely. Good to see you. Looking forward to the show. As always, good to be back.
Coming up tonight, a fourth abuse survivor has quit the grooming gang's inquiry. In response, Keir Starmer has insisted it won't be watered down or very complicated. The two candidates to lead the inquiry have now said they don't want to. So the whole thing's a mess. I'll be joined later on by Dan Evans to talk about the Welsh By-Election. Is Wales swinging to the right? Reform and Plaid are neck and neck to win that by-election. The seat has been held by Labour for over 100 years. Well, not the seat for the Senedd. That's been held by Labour since the Senedd was created in 1999. But the constituency, in terms of the town, let's say, has had a Labour representative for over a century. The warnings about superintelligence are getting louder. I speak to someone from the Institute for the Future of Life. They've organised a letter with some pretty significant signatories. And Andrew Marr concedes he was wrong about Labour. Will anyone defend Keir Starmer? Well, the last pro-Keir Starmer, I suppose, person, commentator, whatever in the country, please stand up. Stay tuned for all of that. Before we get started, though, have you noticed that with the exception of all the content put out by Novara Media, the internet sucks now? And that's the subject of our next Downstream IRL event. Aaron will be speaking to journalist Cory, Doctorow, one of the sharpest tech critics in the world right now. Cory wrote the book In Shitification, Why Everything Suddenly Got Worse and What to Do About It. Really interesting guy. He's sort of explaining why when you go on Google or any of your social media sites, they're just unusable because they've had to maximize for revenue. And I assume it's so sort of advertising is everywhere. That event is on Monday, the 17th of November at Earth Hackney in London. Tickets are available via the link in the description. As ever, if you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. I was about to say apologies for everyone who's not in London because we do these adverts for these events, which, as I say, have been in London so far. But there is obviously a consolation if you're not in London, which is that these brilliant conversations always ultimately get uploaded to YouTube. So you will be able to see that interview with Cory Doctorow if you can't make the event. Although, of course, there is no comparison to the experience of attending one of these things. So do buy a ticket. I assume there'll be a link in the description. The government inquiry into Britain's grooming gang scandal appears to be falling apart before it's even started. And that's because today, a fourth abuse survivor resigned from their role on the Victims and Survivors Liaison Panel. And then the second shortlisted candidate to run the inquiry resigned. And that's the second person on a shortlist of two. So what has led to this fallout? Well, the trouble for the government began on Monday when Fiona Goddard, who's a victim of grooming in Bradford, quit its overseeing panel. Now, Goddard cited concerns that the focus of the inquiry would be diluted, and it would be broadened out beyond cases of street grooming. She also expressed concern at the two people who had been shortlisted to chair the inquiry, and that's former Deputy Chief Constable Jim Gamble and former Head of Child Services in Lambeth, Annie Hudson. And Fiona Goddard wrote this. So she said, "The most concerning development of this inquiry has been the identities of the two prospective chairs. One has a background in policing and the other a social worker, the very two services that contributed most to the cover-up of the national mass rape and trafficking of children. This is a disturbing conflict of interest, and I fear the lack of trust in services from years of failings and corruption will have a negative impact in survivor engagement with this inquiry." Now, following that resignation letter, Annie Hudson, who's the former social worker in this scenario, withdrew her application for the role. But more victims have withdrawn from the panel, including Ellie Reynolds, who spoke to Channel 4 News.
It was almost, don't say anything about the ethnicity. We're going to widen the range. Everything was already planned. There was meetings going on that we didn't know about. It's a scandal. It's completely unfair. And it's got motivation behind it that's not in the favour of the survivors and the victims of this, of the young girls and boys that are still going through it.
Initially, you were told this was going to be a victim and survivor-centred process. How far away is it from that now, to your mind?
It's nowhere near a survivor-led process. I just think it's so far from the truth that it's never been about the survivors. It's been about how to cover up the survivors and silence the survivors from moving forward.
Kemi Badenoch today made those resignations from survivors the focus of her questions to Keir Starmer at PMQs.
Mr. Speaker, 4 victims on the rape gang survivors panel have resigned. And they've resigned because they've lost all confidence in the government's inquiry. So I'm giving my first question to one of them, to Fiona. She said, being dismissed and contradicted by a minister when you're telling the truth takes you right back to that feeling of not being believed all over again. Fiona's question is simple. What's the point in speaking up if we're just going to be called liars?
Prime Minister.
Can I thank her for raising that on behalf of Fiona, and let me give Fiona and the House my answer, Mr. Speaker, because the grooming scandal was one of the worst scandals of our time. Women and girls were abused and exploited by predatory gangs of men, and survivors have been ignored for many years, including by the state that, of course, is supposed to protect them. My vow to Fiona and them is that this national inquiry will change that. I do acknowledge that in recent days, some members, including Fiona, have decided to step away from the panel. I say this, Mr. Speaker, should they wish to return, the door will always be open. But even if they do not, we owe it to them and to Fiona and to the country to answer the concerns that they have raised. The inquiry is not and will never be watered down. Its scope will not change. It will examine the ethnicity and religion of the offenders, and we will find the right person to chair the inquiry.
So in Kemi Badenoch's question there, she was quoting Fiona Goddard, and there was a statement about a minister dismissing and contradicting Fiona Goddard. Now, that was a reference to Jess Phillips, the Minister for Safeguarding, who said this in Parliament yesterday. Allegations of intentional delay, lack of interest, or widening of the inquiry scope and dilution are false. The inquiry will remain laser-focused on grooming gangs, as Baroness Casey recommended. Now, as those were claims about the inquiry made by Fiona Goddard, she interpreted that as Jess Phillips accusing her of lying. And she said this to GB News.
I think it's quite concerning that she would rather try and damage the character of a survivor than take some responsibility herself. I do think Jess Phillips needs to resign. I think the only logical move forward from this point is her resignation. How can she represent women and children's best interests if she would rather try and discredit a survivor, knowing that survivor's being truthful, than take some responsibility herself?
So Fiona Goddard also shared the messages that she says prove that there was a risk of the inquiry being watered down. So these were questions sent by the charity coordinating the inquiry to victims on the oversight panel. So they're called questions for reflection. What do you most want the inquiry to achieve? What areas should it focus on? Are there specific questions or issues you believe the inquiry must address? And then this is the key one. Should the inquiry have an explicit focus on grooming gangs or group-based child sexual abuse and exploitation, or take a broader approach? So it's that third question that seems to have worried Fiona Goddard, who then messaged Jess Phillips to say this. Sorry to message again, but if it's supposed to be about grooming gangs, why has the charity that the Home Office has set up to consult with survivors just sent out the agenda for the questions that are going to be asked? And one is, should this be a grooming gang inquiry or group-based CSE, or should this take a broader approach? Every way this is being manipulated away from what it was supposed to be, and it's unfair. And then Fiona Goddard has also shared Jess Phillips' response. She said this, only just picking this up, I don't want you to misunderstand. The reason for the question is because there have been differing views, and we want you to be able to give a clear steer on what you want. I know it's hard to trust, but I can promise you no one is trying to manipulate the response. And it is my view that it is only a grooming gang specific inquiry. But it is not right for me to make that decision without it being formally consulted on. Now, whether or not sort of those questions count as proof the government was planning to broaden out the inquiry, it's not completely clear to me. You can see, though, why it would give that impression. In any case, the dispute has obviously put a lot of pressure on Jess Phillips with demands for her to resign. And in a debate yesterday, Jess Phillips said this about Fiona Goddard. This was in response to an urgent question in Parliament.
Look, what I will say to the honourable gentleman, which he would know if he had done anywhere near the level of work that I have done, is that not all victims and survivors are of the same opinion. They are not one homogenous group of people who all think the same thing, who all want the same exposure, who all want their identities known. And so what I would say is that I have spoken to Fiona Goddard many times, and I will continue that relationship with her, should that be what she wishes. And every single survivor who has been engaged with, of which there have been many, will have different feelings on this subject.
So she got a lot of criticism for her performance in Parliament yesterday, especially sort of in the right-wing media on GB News and the like. I kind of feel like what she said there made, some sense, right? It is difficult for people to say, oh, the victims are against this process, because we don't know what everyone thinks, because most people are anonymous. It's not exactly like there's going to be interviews of everyone on that panel. But I suppose, again, 4 people resigning is significant. All this chaos, anyway, has led to one more development this afternoon, which is the second candidate in line to chair the inquiry withdrawing his application. So he released the following statement, as I say, Jim Gamble, so former deputy chief police officer. So he said, I had hoped that my track record of fierce independence and child-centred focus, particularly in the CEOP Centre, which I presume is Child Exploitation something centre, and in the operational policing maybe, and in the 15 years since I resigned from the police, would have enabled me to proceed and hold the organisations and individuals who failed these young people to account whilst driving real change. Regrettably, the reaction to the appointment process has been defined more by the vested interests of some, as well as political opportunism and point scoring, rather than by the cross-party consensus required to address such a serious national issue. Victims and survivors who have been let down so often in the past deserve better than to be used as leverage for short-term gain by anyone. So that's actually quite the accusation being made by Jim Gamble, that sort of these people are being used as leverage for short-term gain. Helena, I suppose, it's undoubtable, isn't it, that the Tories are trying to use this for short-term gain. Some people might say that's the nature of politics, though. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the complaints they're making are unwarranted. I find it difficult to make sense of this story, not to make sense of it, but to sort of know where I stand on this story, because I think it's sort of incredibly complicated, morally, politically, etc. What's your, I suppose, reaction to what's been going on over the past couple of days?
Well, it's all a bit of a mess, really, isn't it? I certainly think that you're right to say that the Tories are making a kind of political deal out of this. Of course, there are probably plenty of people on the benches who have a genuine care in violence against women and girls, especially violence against children and sexual violence, etc., etc. I'm not disparaging their concerns over this issue. It does, however, kind of sting a little bit, given the leader of the opposition, Kemi Badenoch, who's the one who is steam forwarding with what's going on here, was quite literally the Minister for Women and Equalities in the previous government, who had every opportunity to be the one doing this inquiry in the first place, given the unsatisfactory conclusion of the Casey review, and didn't do so. She was too busy trying to convince the Financial Conduct Authority to be less trans-inclusive, rather than concentrating on things that actually matter. But regardless, the actual government do come out of this looking pretty bad. Jess Phillips is one of them, right? Now, I certainly think that there is some level to which that this is looking a little bit unfair on her, insofar as it looks as if, given that this was subcontracted out to a grooming gang charity and they were the ones who put forward the questions, there's no real evidence that them including question 3, that really important question about widening the scope, that's really kind of upset a lot of people and caused them to resign from the survivors panel. We don't know whether that was instructed to be included by the government. We only know that that's what the charity gave to these people. We don't know at this point whether or not that someone like Jess Phillips had any hand in wanting to have an opportunity for this to get watered down in the first place. Now, we do see, however, some very conflicting statements by Jess Phillips, insofar as the message that she sent to Fiona Goddard said, it is my opinion that it needs to be laser focused on the grooming gangs, and that they don't want to get it watered down. That's Keir Starmer's statement. But when the other sentence that she said in the Commons was that, well, people have differing views, so it's fine to ask these kind of questions because we want to make sure that everybody's voice is heard on this. She doesn't really have a very specific position on this. And until we know whether or not the government has kind of intervened to get the charity to include that question, we don't really know where they stand. All we know is the contradictory statements, which again, in such a sensitive issue, especially when one of them's in the DMs and it's being leaked rather than what they've openly said in the comments. And that has caused Fiona explicitly to say that she thinks that Jess Phillips is calling her a liar. At this point, it looks really bad. It does look really, really bad for Jess Phillips. One thing I will give Jess Phillips a little bit of credit for as well here is that when it comes to the really big part of this, which is the inclusion of people who belong to institutions that are central to the failure to get to grips with the situation in the first place, i.e. the social services and the police being included as the main people likely to chair this panel. And Jess Phillips responded to the failure of this to come to a satisfactory conclusion in people who are going to chair the inquiry, was saying, well, one of the problems that we have is that basically every institution is implicated in the failure of this, right? One of the big problems is that a lot of these people, they were young girls and they were young white working class girls in very poor areas of the country. These are people that are often overlooked, often are derided by our institutions, definitely the police. The fact that anyone from the police was considered it's very strange to me. But some people from the survivors panel wanted a judge to be included too, but the judiciary also failed these young girls as well. There is layers upon layers of institutional failure. So finding someone who's not from those institutions, who has the knowledge and the understanding to be able to chair this inquiry properly is going to be very difficult. So there is some real push and pull here. But it's the fact that someone from the police was potentially included here that is completely, I have no idea why that was even considered, given that what we know now from continual investigations that police officers were also people who were implicated in these things too, right? Operation Stovewood, I believe, was the National Crime Agency initiative that brought up cases, I think it was in Rotherham, of police officers engaging in the CSA themselves. So this is something where we know, especially given other investigations into our police forces, there is loads of institutional failure. And given that that person who was considered was somebody who was in the police force at the time in which these things were going on and being dealt with in an unsatisfactory manner, that doesn't make sense to me at all. But again, where the government can go from this, it looks like it's really blown up in their faces. It looks like it's going to be really difficult to find a resolution that's satisfactory for everybody. Because on the one hand, there is a really, really important and kind of dangerous status quo that we've had for far too long of young women and girls being failed by layers upon layers of different institutions in our country. And on the other hand, you have a really hot button political topic, which is being used and weaponized to broadly attack minority communities across the country as well. And trying to find a way of being able to sensitively approach this issue without making it into a political storm seems an impossible line to be able to tread. I do not envy the government one bit.
I mean, it's a difficult one as well because I never know how to, because obviously there are people weaponizing it for cynical reasons, but at the same time, the only reason this inquiry is happening in the first place is because Elon Musk decided he wanted to weaponize it for political reasons. So the whole thing is a mess. Labour has for decades dominated Welsh politics. Ever since the Senedd was created in 1999, they've been the largest party and run the Welsh government. But that all looks set to change. Next May, there will be elections for the Welsh Parliament, and Labour are barely in the running. So in the most recent polling, the Welsh Nationalist Party Plaid Cymru are in the lead with 30%. Reform are just behind on 29%, and Labour are down in third place on 14%. So I suppose there could be a junior partner in a government perhaps, but it's not the position they would want to be in. That, of course, means Labour could face a similar fate in Wales to that which they've suffered in Scotland in recent decades, namely irrelevance. And this week, we're getting a preview of what could be a political revolution in Wales, with a by-election in Caerphilly, triggered by the sudden death of the Labour incumbent, Hefin David. Caerphilly in South East Wales has returned a Labour MS to the Senedd every year since the Parliament was created. The town has sent a Labour MP to Westminster since 1918. It's safe to say, though, the Labour candidate will not win tomorrow. According to polling by Survation, Plaid Cymru's Lindsay Whittle and Reform's Claire Powell are neck and neck for the top spot at 42 and 38%. That's according to the latest polls. The Labour candidate is languishing on 12%, down 2/3 from 2021. Now, context here, of course, Plaid could well be the winner here, which would be excellent for them. However, compared to 2021, it's Reform's current polling that looks, I suppose, especially impressive. These were the 2021 results. So back then, Labour got 13,000 votes, Plaid got 8,000, and Reform were down on 500. So to go from sort of being completely irrelevant to potentially leading in the polls is, shows a big change. Now, like in the rest of the country, Reform's rise in Wales has been largely down to their opposition to immigration, which concerned this family, who challenged Reform's candidate at BBC Hustings.
I asked the question about, is immigration a problem for Caerphilly? You started then going on about outside of Caerphilly. So I want you to answer my question as to whether it's a problem for Caerphilly.
Lady next.
Hi, I'm Cole's mother. I'm born and bred in Caerphilly. I've lived here all my life. And I have their father, my other son, is part of the 2.9% that you say are overtaking Caerphilly.
I haven't used that. Right.
Well, you're using that immigration is overtaking the country.
I haven't said that either.
We've lived here all our lives, and I have never felt so unwelcome in my own hometown as I do since your party came into Caerphilly with all the rhetoric that you bring in. I have to say to my sons, please don't go there, please don't do this. And quite frankly, Mr. Powell, I blame you for that.
It's funny it's called Mr. Powell, obviously evocative of Enoch when I was listening to that challenge. So is Wales swinging to the right or just away from Labour? I'm joined by Dan Evans, sociologist and author who lives in Cardiff, so just down the road from Caerphilly. Dan, welcome to the show. What's going on from your perspective in this by-election?
Thanks for having me on. So this has been a long time coming. I do think that this is the start of the end for Labour's hegemony in Wales, and as you said before, Labour have been totally dominant in this part of the world for over 100 years. So their collapse will be enormous. And I think it is a bellwether for the rest of the UK, because if Reform can win in somewhere like Caerphilly with such a strong Labour tradition, then it can and probably will win in other red wall areas across the rest of the UK.
I mean, what to your mind is driving that? What is the turn to Reform? Is it just that people don't like the Labour Party and Reform are the sort of, that they're seen as the obvious opposition, the sort of protest vote, or is it that people like what they're selling?
I think it's a bit of both. Reform have been very good at positioning themselves as like a catch-all protest vote. I mean, there was an interview on S4C the other day with a Reform candidate, not Llyr Powell, but a Reform candidate. And the gentleman was interviewed and sort of asked, what are your policies? And he basically didn't have any. And he sort of said quite nonchalantly, well, it doesn't matter because we're just not the establishment. We're not Labour. And so he's quite proud of the fact they're a protest vote. But in terms of Labour's collapse, I mean, there are so many factors behind this that are both local and national. I mean, Labour are not popular in Wales. There's a bunch of things which have been deeply unpopular locally or on a Welsh level. The 20 miles an hour speed limit, harsher laws during COVID have sort of rubbed people up the wrong way. And there's a general, I mean, obviously I've written a book on this, but Labour's tenure in Wales, I think, has been incredibly unsuccessful and almost like a model of what not to do in power and how to drive the far right. But ultimately, I would say that the real reason that Reform are on the verge of a historic victory is because of the unpopularity of the Westminster government, of Keir Starmer and Labour in Westminster, rather than anything local. Yeah,
I wanted to ask you about that, actually, in terms of Senedd elections. Obviously, this is going to be a big deal next spring. To what extent is Welsh politics about Welsh government, and to what extent do people vote in Senedd elections because of how they feel about the parties in Westminster?
Well, they've traditionally been viewed as what, political scientists call second order elections, as in there's, council elections where, hardly anyone turns out, then you've got Westminster elections. And then the Welsh Assembly elections are somewhere in the middle. And we haven't really been very good at all at driving democratic engagement in Wales. Turnout in the Senedd elections has never passed 45%. And Labour in Wales have been actually really happy with that. Let's be honest, they have not really been bothered about driving democratic engagement because they've been able to get back into power on a small minority of a very, in my view, terrible turnout. But this one is different because it's a by-election, because there's so much news and national focus on it. It makes it a little bit different. The issue has always been, which does lend an element of uncertainty, is that the people who do not like Labour in Senedd elections, and there are a lot of people, and the people who do not like the Senedd and devolution, and there are a lot of those people, don't tend to turn out in the Senedd election. So, the Labour's unpopularity has never really translated into electoral defeat. But this time, if reform can actually mobilise the people who don't normally turn out, then that's why we might see a swing to the right.
Talk to us in a bit more detail. You sort of said Labour in Wales are an example of how not to govern from the centre-left. So could you talk a bit more in detail about what you mean by that? What did they do wrong? What are the lessons to be learned?
Well, how long have we got, really? I mean, Labour in Wales have sort of been defined by incredibly radical rhetoric, constantly talking about how amazing they are, how radical they are, how world-leading they are, but never actually delivering on any of this stuff, and basically the reality has always been, the Welsh Parliament or the Senedd has never had, really the levers it's needed to make a significant change to people's lives. It doesn't control, anything to do with macroeconomic policy. But nonetheless, it talks this good game about how, amazing it's going to be. But the reality is it can't really make that much of a difference, and it hasn't. And as a result, the Labour Party have been, it's almost like the nanny state in action, pure sort of paternalist liberalism in action. Their default instinct, all they tend to do, because they can't do these big things, is they tamper around the edges. They'll ban things like fast food, the 20-mile-an-hour speed limit. Very sort of not, and the problem is when people's lives are getting a lot worse, when Labour are not delivering on the bread and butter issues that affect people's lives, and by every measure in Wales, things have got a lot worse since 1997 or 1999, whatever you want, the start of devolution. Homelessness is up, child poverty is up, education. Educational inequality in Wales is enormous, and Wales is tanking in the international PISA rankings. By any measure, life in Wales has got a lot worse, and yet we're constantly faced by the Labour government telling us how amazing they are and how radical they are. And it's really rubbed people up the wrong way, I've got to say, myself included. So this has been, I think, a real long time coming.
For viewers outside Wales, can you explain the politics of Plaid Cymru?
So Plaid are broadly, I'd say, a centre-left, mild social democratic party, very similar in some ways to the SNP. They have a lot of, I'd say, relatively progressive economic and social and cultural policies. Historically, Plaid have been very associated with the Welsh language and the Welsh, the Welsh speaking minority in Wales, and that's reflected in Plaid's electoral base, which is in the Ifrog Gymraeg, which is the Welsh speaking part of Wales. Now, Plaid have, despite the fact they have officially been a socialist party since the 80s, they've really struggled to break into the largely English speaking former industrial areas of South Wales, with the caveat that places like Caerphilly have all very Welsh identifying, and they've always had a small sort of very entrenched core of Plaid supporters. So this could, Plaid have been doing a lot better, I think. I think Rhun ap Iorwerth has been getting quite favourable press coverage. They are saying the right things, but they really need to win this. I think this by-election to plant a flag in the ground for next year's elections, because it is really looking like it is between them and reform at the moment.
And let's go back to the reform issue. I've sort of, in terms of commentary about this, and in terms of sort of migration being an issue in this election, I've seen lots of people sort of point to the 2021 census finding that only 2.9% of Caerphilly's residents are foreign-born, and sort of saying that shows this concern about immigration is ridiculous. I wondered what you thought about that, this idea that, Wales, which is relative to England, I suppose, not particularly diverse, has a lower level of migration than other parts of England, but still seems to be shifting towards reform. What do you think we can take from that?
Yeah, well, I'm torn on this because, Wales is far less ethnically diverse than England and the rest of the UK, but immigration, Caerphilly as a borough does have a far smaller percentage of people who are born outside Wales, but born outside the UK rather. But and obviously Reform are stoking fear, and they are stoking division, and they are painting migrants as scapegoats. Nonetheless, I think it is worth bearing in mind that places like South Wales, places like the northeast of England, have seen a rapid rise in asylum seekers being relocated there, because as part of the UK government's dispersal process or protocols, or whatever you want to call it, asylum seekers and migrants are often resettled in areas which have the cheapest housing, which in the UK is places like the South Wales Valleys, places like northeast of England, and places like Glasgow. So there has been, I'd say, a noticeable increase in the sort of ethnic diversity of South Wales, which is probably allowing Reform to sort of play on fears, albeit they are massively inflating the issue. But I mean, if you look at, as I've said many times before, immigration is a proxy for general dissatisfaction with the British state and the British political economy. If you look at some of the focus groups that were done by More in Common around Caerphilly, it's the stuff that we would expect. The place is dirty, it's gone to the dogs, there's no jobs, the high street's boarded up, fear of crime. All these things are real. And obviously, Reform have come in and they use immigration as this catch-all issue in which all forms of other dissatisfaction are sort of bound up in. So it's very complicated.
And finally, it all gives me deja vu, because we're talking about sort of right-wing populists versus an incumbent, and then there's the issue of other right-wing populist racists, which is one charge being put at them, and the other is, are they too close to Russia? In this case, it's not all made up. The former leader of Reform in Wales, Nathan Gill, did recently plead guilty to taking bribes from Russia to ask favourable questions for them in the European Parliament, which should be incredibly embarrassing. And I think the candidate was a close associate of this fella, if I'm not wrong. I know that Labour and Plaid have tried to make this an issue in this election. I suppose, what's your impression? Do people care, or do people sort of see this as a bit abstract?
Personally, I don't think, probably people should, but I don't think people care that much. You're right, Llyr Powell is a close associate of Nathan Gill. I don't know if you saw, but there was a hilarious a photo that Llyr Powell posted on social media, which was a photo of people out canvassing in Caerphilly, and one of the people who were out canvassing had his face blurred out, leading people to assume that this was Nathan Gill helping out. So yeah, Nathan Gill implicated in all this dodgy stuff, very close to Farage as well, according to other Reform defectors. But I don't think that's personally cutting through. I think Reform have been very effective at painting Plaid and Labour as the establishment, and painting themselves as the anti-establishment party who are going to shake things up. A friend of a friend was telling me that, people have been saying on his Facebook in Caerphilly that people are literally saying, well, we've tried everyone else. What have we got to lose? What have we got to lose by voting for Reform? So I don't personally think that the Nathan Gill, / Reform's link to Russia is cutting through. And I think Plaid and Labour's sort of focus on it has been a bit strange. There are plenty of other things that you can attack Reform for, not least the fact that we've got a Thatcherite party now claiming, going into South Wales that they decimated, and claiming to be sort of saviours, which is just so surreal and horrendous as to be, we're living in an alternate universe. They should have been focusing on that and the class politics of all this, but instead, no, Reform linked to Russia, wrong-headed in my opinion.
Yeah, I see. I agree with you strategically. Although this is it's really bad to get bribed by Russia.
Yeah, it is bad.
In the European Parliament. Whether or not that's ever going to work as a salient political issue is another question. In any case, Dan Evans, always great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Cheers, Mike. Nice mate.
Andrew Marr is one of Britain's most respected political journalists, and soon after Labour's election last year, he had a spring in his step.
A couple of sources of optimism, because I completely agree with the questionnaire. We have to be optimistic looking forward. I think just having a stable government that will be there for 5, maybe 10 years, who knows, but with sort of ordinary, down-to-earth, serious people talking like the rest of us in charge of the government, and a plan that doesn't shift very much for investment, is going to mean a wall of money coming into this country from around the world. You look at the chaos going on in the continent, particularly in France. You look at the chaos likely ahead in the United States. And suddenly, for once, for the first time in many of our lives, actually Britain looks like a little haven of peace and stability. And that in itself is going to draw money into this country.
Well, it's been a year of the grown-ups in charge. Britain hasn't really been an image of peace and stability. We've had riots on the street. The wall of money is yet to make itself known. Keir Starmer, of course, is the least popular Prime Minister of all time. And now Andrew Marr has had a change of tune. So in the New Statesman this week, he writes, "I thought Labour would fix everything. I was wrong." This is from his article. The Labour establishment had underestimated the deeper difficulties of so much it was facing. The intractable problem of ballooning welfare spending and worklessness, the sheer incompetence of much of the state, the pressure on housing and public services caused by the post-Brexit immigration wave. It did not feel as if a new government meant a new start, not in daily life. Nothing works continued to echo everywhere, from train travellers, swimmers on dirty beaches, millennials struggling to get into decent housing, motorists stuck in urban gridlock, and outraged shopkeepers whose stock had been looted by gangs with no fear of the police. Very quickly, managerialism seemed as disappointing as ever. Helena, that clip of Andrew Marr sort of haunted him online, especially from people on the right. So I don't necessarily want to pile on. Everyone gets things wrong. What can we learn from this, though? Was he sort of the last person who seemed remotely positive about the Labour Party? I suppose there are still 15% of the public who think they're doing not the worst job ever. But what are you taking from this change of heart from Andrew Marr?
I mean, again, I think it's just the fact that at least he's admitting now the dull managerialism and essentially going back to normal, which was essentially the pitch from the Starmerites of the world, which was that we've had the chaos of the Tories, but now we're going to come in, we're going to have probity in office, we're going to just fix the country by being normal and not doing the silly stuff that they did, as if that was going to be enough to save the country. The problem, of course, is that within our broader political and media establishment, no one's really reckoned with the fact that the biggest reason why we're in this mess, there are obviously plenty of reasons, right? Like inequality, institutional capture, the broader status of our economy post-1979 as being entirely beholden to international capital, which we can't convince to stick around. But as far as I'm concerned, the biggest reason for the kind of broader malaise that seems to be affecting everybody, that even if it's in an unequal society, if it had not happened the way that it did, would at least have made things slightly less bad than they are now, is the reality of the policies that took place from 2010 until 2019. It is the austerity policies of the Cameron and Osborne administration coming out of the global financial crisis, a time of a great recession, when the one thing you're supposed to do post-recession is to be able to spend money to get yourself out of the liquidity trap, and they didn't do it. And our political class treated this broadly, even the Labour Party, the sensible centrists that Andrew Marr's kind of got his wind behind, in terms of people like Ed Miliband and Ed Balls, who are part of that same kind of clique from the Labour right at this point, who willingly accepted the inconvenient truth about public spending in the wake of 2010, and this adherence to the kind of Osborneite agenda of sticking to whatever the OBR says as gospel and not moving outside of that broader bubble, has led to the broader economic stagnation that's led us to this point. In fact, it is not the supposed adults in the room that were necessary to be able to fix our country, to get the public investment, to fix all of the things that were kind of collapsing to the point where we're seeing it now across the country rather than just in the poorer areas that we did during the coalition and beyond, is because we needed to engage in more stimulus policy, which was the Corbynite manifesto. That was the whole plan in 2017, right? At the time when interest rates were still very low, the people that Andrew Marr didn't favour, like Jeremy Corbyn and especially John McDonnell and the people who were devising policy in the background, who had the number one best policy to be able to drag our country out of a very long-term economic malaise that has continued to this day, were the people, and they couldn't accept that was the case. That these were the people who had the real solutions, and they still won't accept that those were the people who had the real solutions. And now the 0% interest rate era, it's gone, it's over. But that's no longer something that we have access to. And whilst there has been at least some amount of fiscal expansionary policy, some tweaking of the fiscal rules from Rachel Reeves, it is not the kind of force majeure, kind of upending of the Osborne-like kind of consensus that was built that is necessary to be able to haul our country out of what's happening to everywhere in terms of the kind of faltering economy, like the kind of industrial policy that was necessary to be able to put money into the towns that have been neglected for decades in this country. If you go to Keighley, or you go to Accrington, or you go to Redcar, or you go to anywhere, indeed in Wales, for example, is far more. The scale is so great in terms of what's necessary, and Rachel Reeves is not going to do it. And fundamentally, the biggest problem is that the people, for political reasons, who in the background of the Starmer Politburo decided that, well, we can't win the election if we don't raise tax, if we promise to raise taxes. So they have straitjacketed themselves not only with these fiscal rules, not only by adhering to the OBR agenda that was created from the coalition government, they're also not giving themselves any extra room to be able to put more money in terms of taxable revenue into day-to-day expenditure because of first of all, the fiscal straitjacket, those fiscal rules, and second of all, because of the political decisions made in terms of wanting to win the election. And that's why this doom spiral will continue. There's also another element to this, which is that it turns out like the permanent political class adults in the room that Andrew Marr is claiming that they are just as kind of crooked in terms of the people that they are affiliated with as the Conservatives. This idea that somehow political corruption and having interests that are vested is only the preserve of the Conservative Party because they're a kind of hierarchical party, as was pointed out in the article, obviously very deftly there, that they're related to capital, related to the wealthy, related to like kind of hereditary wealth especially. It turns out in the wake of the kind of Blairite consensus where they kind of sold out the traditional trade union base of the party to changing the way in which that their conferences worked rather than being a kind of a meeting of the broader Labour mass movement from Blairism and onwards outside of the Corbyn interregnum. It was a time in which that they were trying to court the interests of big business and big donors, and it's broadly this subsuming of the economy in the wake of what failed from the financial crisis into the pockets of big business, who were the only people who survived, that's led to our communities having very little wealth, having very little of their own actual kind of community wealth, especially outside of maybe Preston, who seem to have some success there. And this is why across the country, outside of especially urban centres, nothing seems to work at all. There's a real kind of omni crisis at the moment, which it will take far more than just looking sensible and being managerial to be able to solve. It's glad he's recognised this now, but it shouldn't take until a year into a Labour government that's failed and it's basically on its own metrics for him to be able to see that. And if he'd seen this maybe a lot earlier, we'd be in a different position altogether.
Now, I've said I didn't want this to be a pile on Andrew Marr because everyone makes false predictions, but I did find it impossible to plan a section on Andrew Marr making a very bad call without showing you this. It's a reminder of what Andrew Marr said after the fall of Saddam Hussein in 2003.
Well, for the view in Downing Street on today's events, let's talk to our political editor, Andrew Marr. Andy, is it safe to assume that Mr. Blair, like so many of the rest of us, was glued to his television for parts of today?
It certainly is. He and his advisors have been watching this, and all the usual caveats apply. There could be some ghastly scenes in the future. There could be terrorist attacks. All sorts of things could go wrong. But frankly, Hugh, the main mood is unbridled relief. I've been watching ministers wander around with smiles like split watermelons.
Well, Mr. Blair's had his share of troubles and worries, as you rightly say, over the past few weeks. We've talked about them many times.
Yes.
To what extent has that changed now today?
Well, I think this does one thing. It draws a line under what had been before this war a period of when a faint air of pointlessness almost was hanging over Downing Street. There was all these slightly tawdry arguments and scandals. That is now history. Mr. Blair is well aware that all his critics out there in the party and beyond aren't going to thank him because they're only human for being right when they've been wrong. And he knows that there might be trouble ahead, as I've said. But I think this is a very, very important moment for him. It gives him a new freedom and a new self-confidence. He confronted many critics. I don't think anybody after this is going to be able to say of Tony Blair that he's somebody who is driven by the drift of public opinion or focus groups or opinion polls. He took all of those on. He said that they would be able to take Baghdad without a bloodbath and that in the end the Iraqis would be celebrating. And on both of those points, he has been proved conclusively right, and it would be entirely ungracious, even for his critics, not to acknowledge that tonight he stands as a larger man and a stronger prime minister as a result.
It's just, I know, I mean, I've seen that so many times, but I just think it's so telling. Well, the whole job of political editor of the BBC, where your job is to hang around Westminster and basically just absorb vibes. So he's saying it's undoubtable that he stands as a bigger man. The only reason people won't say he was right all along is because they're human and couldn't possibly admit what's right in front of their eyes. Not particularly useful having someone who just wanders around Westminster comment on what's going to happen when you bring down the sovereign government of another nation. The warnings about superintelligence are getting louder. A new open letter signed by political campaigners, celebrities, and Nobel laureates has warned of the dangers of creating artificial superintelligence. The signatories, which include Steve Bannon, Prince Harry, and godfather of AI, Geoffrey Hinton, it's got many signatories. They put their names to the following statement. We call for a prohibition on the development of superintelligence not lifted before there is 1. Broad scientific consensus that it will be done safely and controllably, and 2, strong public buy-in. Now, the letter is organised by the Future of Life Institute. That's the organisation led by the MIT cosmologist Max Tegmark. It follows a letter in 2023, which they organised, which called for a 6-month pause on AI development. Now, the most famous signatory of that letter was Elon Musk. But Musk, who is now investing billions in the race to reach superintelligence, is notably absent from the FLI's latest statement. So is there any point in open letters like these? And can they stop Silicon Valley CEOs hurtling us towards potential AI-induced catastrophe? Well, earlier today, I caught up with Ben Cumming, who is Communications Director at the Future of Life Institute.
So what sort of open letters do and petitions like them do is they're fantastic norm-setting devices. As we saw last year with both FLI's letter around advanced AI development and the subsequent letter from the Centre for AI Safety, which brought together hundreds, thousands of AI experts to talk about these risks and highlight these risks. What they do is introduce the conversation into the mainstream and really demonstrate the diverse range of voices and leaders who feel strongly about this issue. And therefore can provide both the cover and also the rationale for lawmakers to take meaningful action on these issues. So I'd say yes, is the short answer there. A tremendous norm-setting mechanism and a way for both experts, noteworthy individuals, prominent figures, and the general public to show lawmakers and, of course, the AI companies themselves that they're deeply concerned about this reckless, frantic race towards machines we can't control.
And I mean, there was a notable absence on this letter because, I mean, you've just referred to it there. In 2023, your institution put out a letter calling for a 6-month pause to AI development. Probably the most prominent, most famous signatory then was Elon Musk. Since signing that letter, he's gone on to become, head of one of the key firms, which is racing towards superintelligence, XAI. I suppose, should we understand him not signing this letter as he is now on the side of let's race to superintelligence as quickly as we can?
I think what we should possibly see it as is an indication that a lot of these AI companies, even if they see this race as being fundamentally dangerous, they also find themselves locked in this frantic competition in order to get there first. There's very much this case of, whatever happens, you can't be last. And this actually highlights a real sort of consensus among some of these AI company leaders, which is that they admit that this race towards AGI and superintelligence is very, very dangerous. I mean, you heard Dario Amodei just the other week saying there's a 25% chance this goes very badly wrong. Demis Hassabis just last year at the World Economic Forum was talking about, I wish I had another decade to just work on narrow AI systems. And even Mustafa Suleyman from Microsoft AI said in an interview, we shouldn't build stuff that we can't control. We should only build systems that we can control, that can meaningfully address actual problems affecting people. Yet nonetheless, these companies are racing ahead and are in this frantic race to the bottom. So I think that's what they're doing.
I mean, is there a sense that that's letting them off the hook slightly? Because I keep hearing this argument, we have to do it so someone doesn't do it first. But then there's never an explanation as to why it would be better if... So Sam Altman always says, sort of, OpenAI have to do it because otherwise someone else will do it first. And my understanding was one reason Elon Musk became an investor in OpenAI is because he didn't want Demis Hassabis at Google DeepMind to get to AGI first. And they're all saying, we need to get to it first so someone more dangerous doesn't get there first. But they can never explain why they're any less dangerous than the alternatives. I mean, a similar argument comes up with the United States and China, where all these American companies say, we have to get there first, otherwise the Chinese might, and that would be even worse. And they can't explain why it would be better if America gets there first, or Sam Altman or Dario Amodei gets there first. So I suppose this idea that they're locked in this collective action problem where none of them can sort of just say, we don't want to do this anymore. I feel like they should just do that. They should just say, look, we're not going to invest this money in super intelligent AI because we think it's a bad idea, and I'm going to put my money where my mouth is and say, let's not do this.
Yeah. And look, the money is the key word here. I certainly don't think that this sort of, well-meaning, but, this well-meaning competition trap is the only thing driving them. There is tremendous amounts of money to be made in replacing human beings at various functions and roles in their lives. And we're already seeing that now, whether or not that's as workers, which is the most obvious example, and we're already seeing the impacts there, but also as companions, as teachers, as parents. And this is another thing that we hit upon, which is, the statement on superintelligence, which we just put out, is not just about what we should steer away from, which is uncontrollable systems that are explicitly designed to replace people, but also what should we steer towards, which is controllable AI tools which address specific problems, like curing diseases, like solving energy crises, like education. But instead, the market incentives are driving this race to build systems to replace people wholesale in their jobs and beyond. So yes, there is also a tremendous amount of money to be made, which is the other thing driving them.
And our audience seems to be quite split whenever we talk about this. I'd say it's somewhere, it's close to 50-50, I think, of people who think that concerns about superintelligence, I suppose posing an existential threat, is real, and people who think this is all just nonsense talked up by AI executives, and people who are getting carried away with a sci-fi scenario. The audience is split between those two positions. I'm very much in, this is a real threat. I think that the people who were telling me that superintelligence could be dangerous, I take many of them seriously, and I can't see a really strong argument why this isn't something we shouldn't worry about. But obviously, you work more at the coalface of this. So I suppose, what would you say to a skeptical viewer who thinks that this is all nonsense, the idea that superintelligence might be a threat to humanity?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an AI or an AGI expert. I always defer to the insights of people far smarter than myself and who I work with and who I'm fortunate enough to spend every day listening to. However, I would actually say this, which is, even if you do not necessarily believe that uncontrollable superintelligence is round the corner, although I would say that shortening timelines and the rapid advances we've seen over the past 3 years, as well as the consensus among experts, indicates that it probably is. I would say that even if you don't believe that, what we can agree is that right now, AI companies are racing to build systems which are already reaping untold damage and immeasurable damage on lives and livelihoods around the world. They're concentrating power in extraordinary ways. They are supercharging disinformation and deepfakes. They are, killing careers and filling the internet with slop. And as I said before, they are concentrating not just the economic power, but also the political power and the influence power of the world into the hands of, a few Silicon Valley billionaires. So either way, the trajectory of AI development that we're on right now is incredibly bad. And we're not getting the things that we want. They've said, we're going to build these things to cure cancer. Are they? I haven't seen evidence of that work. All I've seen is, the internet being filled with slop and young people about to lose their careers and beyond. So I would posit that, it's not just about, the imminent loss of control to superintelligence, although I could certainly spend a lot of time talking about why that is. It's also about the fact that right now, we are on a trajectory that is, frankly, terrifying either way. And we urgently need, lawmakers to step in and pass meaningful safety standards on AI, the same as we have for every other industry: airlines, pharmaceuticals, sandwich shops. The government has seen fit that there is enough danger posed by poor behavior and negligence in these spaces that there needs to be safety standards and there needs to be legal liability. If we're going to do that for them, why on earth wouldn't we do it for something that everyone agrees can pose such incredible harm to our society and already is reaping such incredible harm upon our society? Superintelligence to one side.
Yeah, so you've said, you're not the AI expert at the organisation, as Max Tegmark and others. You're communications director. So let's, I suppose, focus on that side of things, and I suppose the lobbying that your organisation does. And I suppose I want to get your sense of what people in Washington, because presumably that's the place where this matters most, because that's where most of the frontier AI companies are. What are they thinking about this? Are they genuinely worried about AI, I suppose, either in terms of taking people's jobs or in terms of a super intelligent takeover risk, but scared to do something about it because the tech lobby is so powerful? Or do you think all of them are sort of thinking, this is so uncertain, I've got some people telling me this could be really dangerous, I've got other people telling me this is nonsense, I'm going to campaign on something I can feel a bit more sure about. So if you're on the right, maybe that's tax cuts. If you're on the left, maybe that's social security. Is the issue that just the AI debate is so speculative, there's so much uncertainty, that anyone who is a politician, right, not someone who's an expert in coding or artificial intelligence, they just don't really, I suppose they can't get the conviction to feel strongly enough to push for change?
I mean, I would say that, it's certainly right to point out that, that there is fear of the wrath of, big tech's lobbying might. I mean, I don't know if you saw the over $200 million super PAC that was announced by Andreessen Horowitz and Meta, which is a big war chest to be aiming at anyone who stands up for AI regulation. So there is certainly that pressure. But I would say that you talked about that speculative element, but I think for a lot of these lawmakers, that speculation is going out the window. We are seeing the real harms to families, to lives and livelihoods, and these are issues that directly affect their constituents. I mean, when you're talking about the mental health and psychosis of young people, and you're talking about people in your state losing jobs, these are issues that lawmakers have a responsibility and a mandate to care about. And I'd say this is why they're not doing nothing. I mean, we saw when there was an attempt to pass federal preemption earlier this year, which would have banned all state-level AI regulation. It was completely hammered. It was thrown out 99-1. The person who put that bill forward had to wind up voting against it because so many senators stood up and said, no, this is terrible. We need the right to protect our constituents and their families and their lives and their livelihoods against the threat posed by these systems and these companies. And this has in particular been supercharged and brought to the fore by some of the terrible stuff that has come to light recently. I mean, Meta's internal AI risk guidelines leaking and showed them saying, and this is something that was presumably checked by lawyers and checked by PR experts, saying it's acceptable for their chatbots to engage in romantic or sensual conversations with children, which is such a million miles away from certainly what lawmakers and their constituents think. I would also say common decency.
I suppose these broader concerns are somewhat separate to the letter, aren't they? Because the harms you're talking about, I suppose they're happening already, and they don't require superintelligence. So superintelligence is something more specific, and the concerns about superintelligence are those more sci-fi sounding ones, takeover risk, for example. I suppose let's end on sort of the wording of this letter. So we call for a prohibition on the development of superintelligence not lifted before there is broad scientific consensus, et cetera, et cetera. But the development of superintelligence. So what counts as the development of superintelligence? Because, lots of them are quite openly saying at the moment that what they're aiming for is superintelligence, but no one seems to be suggesting that ChatGPT 6, for example, is going to be superintelligent. Maybe some people are. But at what point do we get worried? At what point can we think, oh, this thing which is just intelligent, which can be dangerous in some ways, but no one's particularly worried that ChatGPT 5 is going to take over the world and kill us all. How does one know, superintelligence is about to happen? This is when we stop the research.
Well, I would certainly say that one should start getting worried now. I think would be my stance on it. I think in terms of what is superintelligence, I mean, the letter has a definition which lays it out fairly clearly. I'm paraphrasing here, but a general purpose system that autonomous AI system that is better than humans at all cognitive tasks, all tasks. And your question was, at what point, do we know that we've reached superintelligence? I mean, I think at that point it will be too late, which is kind of the point. And it's more about placing the burden, upon companies to prove that these systems are safe before releasing them. And to establish the norm that we shouldn't allow companies to race to build things that they can't control. And at the very least, we should have a safety standard put upon them that says you need to be transparent about the systems that you're developing and the risks they pose, the different safety mechanisms that you're putting in place in order to prevent those risks from being realized. I think that's sort of probably where I would land it. I would say, there are certain characteristics of systems that would make us very worried, and we're already seeing them. I mean, we're already seeing systems trying to blackmail their users when they're threatened to being shut down. We're already seeing them trying to sort of reward hack systems and cheat at games and fake alignment, fake being safe to their testers in order to get deployed. As well as duplicating themselves across other systems when they fear shutdown. So I think all of these are characteristics of an autonomous system that we should be worried about. I think, unfortunately, this is one of those areas where if you actually build superintelligence and you haven't taken these steps already to make sure that it is safe and controllable, then it may already be too late. And I think the public buy-in thing is a very interesting one as well. I mean, the polling that we released concurrently with the statement demonstrates that lots of people don't want superintelligence at all for a lot of the reasons that I've discussed. But almost everyone thinks that we shouldn't build it until it's safe and controllable.
That was Ben Cumming from the Future of Life Institute speaking to me earlier today. And that wraps it up for today's show. Thank you to Helena, NoJusticeMTG, and to Dan Evans for joining me this evening. We'll be back tomorrow. For now, good night. You've been watching Novara Media.